Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of the Culture and Justice Reform podcast with me, SP Parker, and Emma Wells. And today we're talking to Jennifer Thetford-Kay, who is something of an activist in the field of justice reform and a writer on the subject. But moreover, she's a teacher, and she's very aware of the issues that young people face with sex education and various other things about the culture wars, which she'll tell you about, led on by my wonderful colleague, Emma. What do you reckon, Emma?
Yes, Jennifer, it's lovely to meet you. Can I call you Jenny?
Yeah, that's fine. Lovely to meet you.
Okay. If you want to give us a little bit of background about where you're coming from and where you are and where you want to be in the future, that would be marvellous.
So I've been teaching for just over 12 years. Prior to that, I worked with people with disabilities, so I'm a very caring person, but my teaching of 16 to 19-year-olds, obviously we teach personal health, sex education, the changes that happen with consent laws and equality acts and other things. So I've studied social sciences, biological sciences, so I'm coming at it from both angles. And so the point of the podcast for me really is where I'm coming from. I'm teaching, obviously, no means no, that's the end of it. But when you're actually in the situation, how does that work for young people? And how can we teach that better rather than just doing the biological graphics of getting together with people? And this is the safe sex part, which is the mandatory taught element rather than the communication, accountability and responsibility, and that side of things for me is something that's sadly lacking with young people these days, and something that I feel is needed in education.
Okay.
What Jennifer, what part of the education sort of system is lacking as far as you're concerned? What's the issue with what's going on in classrooms, if you think there's an issue?
I teach in a college, not a school, so there's a slight difference. That school is now mandatory to teach PSHE, but it's kind of...
What's that?
Personal sexual health education and social, but it's kind of really very minimal about what a relationship is, and they'll talk about sexuality, gender, safe sex, use of condoms, all that kind of thing. But I think what's lacking is the nuances of dating and relationships, which has massively changed for the younger generation from my generation, because of social media and technology. So it's very, very different, and there's all sorts of pitfalls that they can fall into quite easily. And then we end up in situations where people can get into trouble, or either legally or personally, because they didn't have the skills and the tools available to them to empower themselves in a situation.
What does that mean there? What does that mean? They didn't have the tools and skills to empower themselves. It sounds like jargon, but I don't think you mean it like jargon, do you?
Oh, sorry. See, I always say if you can't explain it to a 7-year-old, you're not doing a good job. So
I know it's much harder for me, honestly. So, good luck.
I do it that way. No, that's how I tell students. If you can't explain it easily, you don't understand it properly. So I was kind of brought up with a vehemently passionate view of feminism in terms of empowering women to be strong, to be accountable, to be able to stand up for themselves, to get the job, date, but to take accountability and responsibility for what they were doing with their lives. That was my kind of view of it. And then when we had the 90s, and now we've got them with the noughties, and now where we're at now, it feels like that's not the message anymore. The message seems to be that women need to be protected, girls need to be protected. I'm not saying they don't, but the message isn't really let's be strong, let's learn how to communicate. And we're not teaching boys, let's how to communicate with girls or boys or whoever they want a relationship with. We're not teaching them those skills. Dating's changed, because you used to meet at the pub or meet with a friend, or that's sort of not how it happens. So on social media, either on Snapchat or they slide into the DMs on Twitter or Instagram, and you can portray yourself as confident and whatever you like on social media. Yeah. And then when they meet up in person, they can end up in a situation that maybe they're not comfortable in, but they don't know how to get out of that situation because they haven't been taught how to communicate on a one-to-one situation. They feel like they might know someone because they've had this social media exchange. They've never actually met them in person. Excuse me. This is very different. And they might not be what they said they were going to be online. And sometimes when you meet someone in real life, what you thought was the expectation of, oh, it's going to be so lovely and so is not there. And then they may feel obliged to go along with things that they don't really want to go along with, or feel like they should because they've made the person meet them.
So kind of, is it correct to assume then that you're saying that because of the way they're interacting these days before they meet, then the consent issues that are talked about a lot are kind of compromised in some way? Is that what you mean? Or am I misreading it?
In some cases, I think a lot of the issue is they feel like they know the other person. I mean, I've had students that have had a year-long relationships but never physically met a person. And I'm not saying older people don't do that as well. I'm not just it, but older people have had other relationships generally to sort of gauge it off. So they're very young, the brains aren't fully developed, so it's really exciting and everything's love, and they always assume that because you're older you don't get it, and you're old, you don't understand what it's like to be young. I remember being 16.
Yeah.
Every
that's what they're supposed to say. That's what they say. That's how it is. You know, that's the younger generation, isn't it?
But then all of that excitement and that build up, and who you've portrayed and who they've portrayed themselves to be, maybe online or however they've met, quite often online these days. When they meet in person, some people can feel obliged to go along with things because there's an implied that we've already had a long-term relationship before we've physically met, and that can skew their ideas of boundaries.
Okay, so at what point does this obligation that you're talking about, and you know because you deal with them, at what point does that obligation become a lack of consent? I mean, it's a very important line there, isn't it?
Yeah, well, for me, it's a no means no, but I don't think they've got the skill. This is my point. I don't think people have the skills. I think they may go along with something, and then it's after the fact that they feel like they were coerced. It's after the fact that they regret. It's after the fact that they wish they'd not done it. And that's the problem. It's this lack of ability to have a conversation about what they're okay with and not okay with. I mean, a lot of them send pictures of intimate areas to each other before they've physically met up with a person. So, and you can't know the other person's brain, but there may be an assumed consent going on from either side because
assumed consent. Because
I've seen your parts. And I mean, I keep telling people don't send naked photographs, but it seems to be a lot more popular these days than you would hope to imagine it was. And it's trying to get into the mindset of people that's not consent. It's so muddy. Even the legal definition of consent is quite muddy.
Is it?
Yeah, because you can say, yes, I want to do things, but you can say no at any time. But saying no, just the word no. You could remember you're talking to teenagers. If you say no, it might be no, not like that, move this way. So there needs to be more than just the word no. And I think it needs clarifying in a way that young people feel confident enough to say, these are my boundaries. This is what I'm okay with. And at any point, if I'm uncomfortable, they need to say, I'm not comfortable with this. I don't think no means no is a good enough version of consent. I think it needs to be.
Okay, you've just kind of contradicted yourself there. You know that, right?
Have I?
Yeah, I mean, you said earlier that no means no, and we understand what you mean. And then you say this.
Yeah, but I don't think
Just
it's
saying.
enough.
Just saying.
Yeah, that's the message that's out there. And I'm not saying that that's wrong in the sense of, because it does, no means no. But to young people, trying to get no out in a situation that's understood as, let's stop this situation, they need a bit more ability to communicate that I'm not comfortable with this. These are my boundaries. This is what I don't want to continue with. And they don't have that conversation. A lot of people just meet up for sex and sadly.
Do you not think that perhaps that the films and the lyrics of songs and all this media that's being pushed onto young children these days are leading to them not being able to set boundaries, because they get into sexual situation with people, and they've seen it on the TV. A guy or a girl tries something and they think, I'm not really comfortable with this, but I've seen it on TV, so it must be acceptable. Do you not think that perhaps has some bearing on what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the song lyrics, the words used are definitely potentially an issue. Because, I mean, the words in some songs, you wouldn't have heard them.
No.
And I'm not necessarily saying that we should censor words.
A very, very recent song, WAP, by, I think it's Cardi B, isn't it? Somebody. It's the most atrociously rude, disgusting, lyrically worded text that you could possibly.
Okay, Emma, go on. Give us an example of that.
It's a Cardi B. I'm not going to rap the lyrics to you. I'm no rapper, but it's something that you would never say about yourself. Never mind the rest of the female population. You wouldn't make those words up. They're horrendous, aren't they, Jenny?
Yeah, I think
she won awards for it.
It's under the cloak of.
I'm going to have to listen to this afterwards, obviously. So.
Yeah.
Thanks for turning me on to that, Emma.
Yeah.
Put out there saying, my pussy's this, my pussy's that. These girls are listening to this, these 14, 15, 16-year-old girls of current sexual maturity, and they're thinking, well, that must be right. It's his pussy. That's what it is. And that's where I believe a lot of it is coming from, is from these lyrics and these words and images that have been put into young people's heads, where they think that the extraordinary is actually the norm, and it isn't. It really isn't the norm.
Extraordinary is actually the norm.
Or anything extraordinary that's involving sex. Even the simplest thing of having a guy put his hand around your throat, that's normal in a relationship where somebody has said, we will engage in that. It's not normal when you rock up to meet somebody for the first time, and you've been chatting with them for however long, but they're falling into these traps and these relationships, and things are going dreadfully wrong, dreadfully quickly, because of the normality that's being pushed onto these kids, that's acceptable and that's okay, and it isn't. It really isn't okay.
So kind of is it sort of correct to assume then, kind of as the guy in this conversation here, that the kind of instruction that the kids are getting from the authorities is quite complex, whereas the instruction they're getting from their pop stars and their other influences is more kind of messy and human, that sort of thing, and they can't get those things together. Is that right, Jennifer? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the message from my students will listen more, I would say, to Instagram influencers than they would the parent in this sort of situation. I think one of the Kardashians has just released some pictures, I think it was yesterday, of her bottom completely out. Apparently that's empowering.
Fair. We're not going to diss anybody who wants to morph their body into something.
If they want to be naked, they can be naked. But my issue with that is we've turned being naked into empowering. And I don't think that everybody necessarily internally feels empowered naked, because the view of what naked's supposed to look like isn't what they look like. So they can get like a false sense of self-esteem by likes on particular body areas by sending it, but that's not the same as building your own self-esteem based on something real and tangible. So that sort of imagery for both boys and girls is unrealistic. It's not a real estimation of what they're going to see. And in terms of sort of studies, you know, talk about lyrics and TV, I think the biggest issue is the accessibility of porn on their phones. And a lot of children have been exposed to pornographic images. There's lots of studies. One of them's recently done by the NSPCC. And it's quite often that the pop-ups on a game that a child's playing, it's not that they're necessarily searching for that image or anything. The people that have all the money, obviously sex and money go together. So they'll program in.
That's very controversial. Okay.
No, that's not controversial. I think we've known that for a long time.
All of time.
I might be controversial about lots of things, but I think we're all aware that
so always have.
So the pop-up and curiosity when you're a teenager, you've got hormones raging and everything else, and then they're exposed to things that can be quite graphic in terms of the content of it's and it's not realistic. And I don't think they quite. There's a study done, I'm just going to quickly check, it was 53% of the boys felt it was a realistic depiction of sex, and 39% of girls felt it was a realistic depiction.
That's half and half on the boys' front. Half and half is okay, isn't it?
Slightly over half thought it was realistic for boys and 40% for girls.
That's because half people think things. Half of them think it's right, half of them don't think it's right. So isn't that quite normal? When it comes to stats,
for teenagers to think that the pornographic sex is realistic.
Well, the half that do and the half that don't.
Yeah, but it's the half that do that we need to worry about. Because the thing is, if you go to the movies and you see a superhero movie, you understand that humans can't fly around, or Superman wasn't an alien that landed here, and he doesn't really exist.
You're breaking my heart here, Jennifer. What are you doing? Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert for everyone that's into the Marvel universes. But we understand that that's a fantasy. So we sort of need to bring into that, and children understand that from quite a young age, I think, much younger than they're exposed to, that what they're seeing isn't realistic in the same way that what they see at the movies isn't realistic. And how we have that conversation would massively help, I think, young people. It sort of correlating the two things. But parents don't necessarily want to talk to children about porn. Sorry, Emma.
No, I'm just saying, how would you broach bringing that into a contextual way of bringing it to the children? How would you go about it? As I stepped in there, you're saying that children don't like speaking to the parents about porn. So how, in your type of career, would you go about doing that? It's a very difficult, because there's graphic porn and then there's graphic porn, and there's things that kids are exposed to that would blow any adult's mind who's never been exposed to it. So as a teacher, how would you bring that into the equation? How would you even begin to do that?
I think it needs to be age appropriate, and because I teach 16 to 19-year-olds, I'm in a slightly different position to people teaching in high school. I don't think you need to go into the graphics of it at too young an age.
No.
I think all sex education should be age appropriate as you go along, and children might ask a question at age 7 and you just give them the simplest of answers and then move along. You're not going to sit them down for an in-depth topic. But I think it's naive to assume 16-year-olds haven't seen pornographic material. They may or may not have told you they have, but most likely they will have. So it's how the problem is schools doing it. I will ask students if they're uncomfortable, but schools doing it, you need parental consent, and that's a whole nother issue, because some parents don't want you talking to the children about anything.
I never did. Never allowed it. No.
But how you enforce parents to talk to children about it is another issue.
It's the Scandinavian idea, isn't there, that it's good to expose kids to this sort of thing early, get it out of the system. Because I remember seeing porn in the 80s, way back in magazines, and going, oh, that's interesting, that's not for me. That was my reaction. Honest gov, that really was. And I don't know how that is for kids anymore, seeing that they're on YouTube or whatever else. Don't they just get it out of the system in the same way, or are they wired differently? Are they always just out for that kind of hit?
No, there's worse. Something more graphic, isn't there? There's always something more.
Yeah, but introduction to the fact that there is porn and sex education, there's all the studies show that actually they have a reduced interest in going out to try it than if you don't encourage them to do sex education and talk about it.
Is that the studies? Is that the studies going on? If they're exposed to the porn, there's a reduced interest to try it.
Not porn, sex education and talking about it, not necessarily watching it.
Okay. Discussions
around sex education and what's acceptable in relationships, what do different bodies look like, etc.
So is it a good idea, just to put this to you, is it a good idea to actually show the porn in class, not in a, well, hey, let's get off on this kind of way, but in a, this is what's going on, what do you think class kind of way, like a debate? Is that a good idea, or is that just weird? I don't know, I'm just thinking outside of the box.
That's weird. I'm not a teacher. I think that's weird.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know about it being in the classroom. I mean, you have films that a lot of them seem like the 50 Shades of Grey, which is a mainstream film. And
very stylish, I thought. I wasn't watching the sex part. It's just the style.
The thing about it is, it's still bringing BDSM into normality, and it's not. So you meet up with a guy who's 17. I'm not 17. It's a very long time since I was 17, sadly. But you meet up with a guy and he puts his hand around your throat. I know I said this earlier, but you think, I watched that on TV. It's perfectly normal. And it's not. And then after the event, the girl walks away and thinks, I really didn't want to do that. He's overstepped the mark. He's done something to hurt me. But she didn't have the confidence to say no because she's been exposed to that. And she's seen it and thought, well, it's normal. But then she's come away from it, not having been taught about, obviously can't teach people these things, but she's never discussed it with anybody else. So she comes away and thinks, I've been violated. I didn't consent to that. And she didn't consent to it. But it's the opening the boundaries for people to speak about it and know about how to say no and know about how to say yes. And that's what I think we're talking about today. I hope we are anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
it's
yeah. So the interesting thing about that film specifically, that the thread that runs through it is there's a contract in it.
Yes.
The back and forth about what's okay, what's not okay, and at no point does she ever actually sign said contract, which I think would be unrealistic in real life for a genuine relationship. I'm not talking about the BDSM world. I don't really know whether they do contracts or not, to be honest. She never actually signs it, but the one time she allows him to do whatever he wants to do, she feels violated, and they split up. I don't know if you've watched all 3 of the films.
Just the first one, that was enough for me.
I didn't read the books. But so it's all lovely it's all like, oh, it's so romantic, he's a billionaire. It's like some modern day fairy tale. It's just that he's, you know, using me sexually, which is a modern take on a fairy tale, until she lets him do whatever it is he wants, and then she feels violated and they split up.
Yeah.
And she did consent to it, but it didn't stop her feeling violated. And I mean, they got over it and they lived happily ever after, but that's not a realistic view of the world, let's be honest. So I do think the conversations need to happen about, you know, what people like to experiment when they're young. I understand that. And people don't know what they like until they've maybe tried it. But you need to trust somebody to do that. And just hooking up with people isn't a situation where you can trust somebody to know whether you can experiment with them putting their hands around, to me, because you don't know.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap this up soon because it's doing its thing. Just before we do, Jennifer, I've got one question.
Yeah.
They're just apparently trying to import the concept of enthusiastic consent here in the courts. What do you think of enthusiastic consent? Good idea or not a good idea? If you don't have enthusiastic consent, you're kind of guilty. Any opinion? You've got 10 seconds.
No, no.
No, not a good idea.
No, because if you're both drunk and you're kissing and one thing leads to another, you've not really had a discussion about what you're doing anyway. That's a natural way of being together. That's the problem.
That's right. And I'm not giving you a chance to finish this, so sorry about that. Okay. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Jennifer. Lovely to meet you. See you on the next next podcast. Bye bye. Bye bye. Well done. You okay? Happy?
Yeah, I told you I've got loads more that I could have